The smell of fresh coffee and grilled burgers filled the air at Millie's Diner, a small but cozy place that had been serving the town for over 30 years. The checkered floor had seen better days, and the red vinyl booths were cracked in places, but the food was good and the prices fair. Behind the counter, Jenny wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She'd been on her feet for nearly 10 hours already, and her shift wouldn't end for another 3. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her blue uniform had a small coffee stain near the pocket that wouldn't come out no matter how many times she washed it. At 24, Jenny was older than most of her friends who had already finished college. Life had thrown her some curveballs, first her dad getting sick when she was supposed to start school, then her mom needing help with the bills. But Jenny had a plan. Every tip, every extra shift went straight into her nursing school fund. 3 more months of double shifts, and she'd have enough for her first semester. "Order up," called Lou, the cook who'd been working at Millie's since before Jenny was born. He slid 2 plates of steaming meatloaf across the counter. Jenny grabbed the plates and carried them to table 8, where an elderly couple smiled up at her. Mr. Wilson, who came in every Tuesday with his wife for the meatloaf special, winked at her. "You look tired, honey. You working doubles again?" "Yes, sir," Jenny replied with a genuine smile. Getting closer to that nursing school dream every day. Mrs. Wilson patted her hand. "You'll make a wonderful nurse, dear." Most of the regulars at Millie's were like the Wilsons, kind, decent people who treated the staff with respect. But not all of them. The bell above the door jingled, and the diner fell oddly quiet. Jenny didn't need to look up to know who had just walked in. She could feel it in the sudden tension that filled the room. 5 men in leather jackets strolled in, their heavy boots thumping against the linoleum floor. The smell of cigarettes and motor oil followed them as they claimed the large corner booth, spreading out their jackets and helmets to take up as much space as possible. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, caught Jenny's eye and smirked. Hank Turner and his motorcycle gang rode through town a few times a month, and whenever they stopped at Millie's, the whole staff braced themselves. "Guess who's serving us today?" Hank called out loudly to his buddies. "It's College Girl." The nickname was meant to mock her, and the others snickered on cue. Jenny took a deep breath, picked up 5 menus, and approached their table. She'd learned that ignoring Hank's comments only made things worse. Better to get their order and keep things moving. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said with her professional voice. "Can I start you off with some drinks?" Hank leaned back, stretching his arm across the back of the booth. A skull tattoo peeked out from under his sleeve. "Well, look at that professional tone. You practicing for when you're a fancy nurse?" His friends laughed again. Jenny kept her smile fixed in place. "Today's special is meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans for $8.99. "I don't want your special," Hank said, not even glancing at the menu. "Bring us 5 beers and those spicy wings. And make sure they're actually spicy this time." "I'll put that right in," Jenny said, turning to walk away. "Hey, I'm not done ordering," Hank called after her. When she turned back, he added, "And make sure you don't mess it up like last time. I know taking orders is complicated for someone who thinks they're smart enough for college." At the counter, an imposing figure sat quietly, watching the scene unfold while finishing a slice of apple pie. The man was huge, easily 6'7", with broad shoulders that strained against his plain gray t-shirt. A baseball cap partially covered his face, but anyone looking closely would recognize former basketball star Shaquille "Big Shaq" Johnson. Big Shaq sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving the biker's table as Jenny hurried to the kitchen, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He'd been coming to Millie's every day since moving to town 3 weeks ago to open his youth center, and he'd seen enough of Hank's behavior to know this was just the beginning. What Hank didn't know was that his day was about to take an unexpected turn. Jenny pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, her hands slightly shaking as she grabbed a tray and 5 frosted mugs from the shelf. The kitchen was hot and noisy, with Lou flipping burgers on the grill and the dishwasher clanking plates in the background. "Those bikers again?" asked Tammy, the other waitress on shift. She was in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and had seen it all in her 20 years at Millie's. Jenny nodded, filling the mugs with cold beer from the tap. "Yeah, Hank and his gang." Tammy shook her head. "Don't let that jerk get to you. He's just a big man with a small brain. I know, Jenny sighed, arranging the beers on her tray. I just need to get through today. Tips have been good this week. In the dining area, Hank and his friends had grown louder. They'd pushed 2 tables together, taking up even more space in the corner. One of them, a skinny guy with a snake tattoo on his neck, was tossing sugar packets at the napkin dispenser, missing more often than not. Jenny balanced the heavy tray on her shoulder and made her way back through the dining room. She noticed several regular customers giving her sympathetic looks. Mr. Wilson frowned at the bikers, but like most people, he wasn't about to say anything to a group of men who looked like they enjoyed fighting. Here are your beers, Jenny said, carefully setting each mug down. Your wings will be out in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Hank complained, loud enough for everyone to hear. What's taking so long? Is the cook as slow as you are? Jenny bit her tongue. The kitchen's backed up a bit. Friday lunch rush. Well, ain't that just too bad? Hank said with fake sympathy, then suddenly stuck his boot out into the aisle as Jenny turned to leave. She saw it at the last second and sidestepped, but in doing so, bumped into the table. Beer sloshed over the rim of one mug, soaking into Hank's leather jacket sleeve. Look what you did, he shouted, jumping up and making a show of shaking off his arm. This is real leather, you know what that costs. I'm so sorry, Jenny said quickly, grabbing napkins from the dispenser. Let me help. Get away, Hank growled, shoving her hand aside. The push wasn't hard, but it was enough to make Jenny stumble back a step. You've done enough damage. Where's your manager? I really am sorry, Jenny tried again, feeling her face burn as other customers turned to watch. It was an accident. I can get you another beer. An accident? Hank sneered. Like it was an accident the last time when my burger had no bacon, or the time before when the fries were cold. One of his friends, a bald man with a thick gold chain, laughed. Maybe she's just too busy thinking about those medical books to focus on her real job. Jenny felt a lump forming in her throat. She'd mentioned her nursing school dreams to a few friendly customers, but apparently Hank and his gang had been listening too. Look at her, Hank continued, addressing the entire diner now. Thinks she's better than this place. Thinks she's gonna be somebody important someday. Can't even carry a tray of drinks without making a mess. The diner had gone quiet. Jenny stood frozen, tray clutched against her chest like a shield, every instinct telling her to run to the break room and cry. But she couldn't afford to lose this job. I'll get you another beer, on the house, she managed to say, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Oh, how generous, Hank mocked, then deliberately knocked his half-empty mug over. Beer spread across the table and dripped onto the floor. Oops, I had an accident too. His friends roared with laughter. Jenny knelt down and began mopping up the spill with napkins, keeping her head down so no one could see the tears welling in her eyes. At the counter, Big Shaq set his coffee cup down with a deliberate clink. He'd been watching the entire scene, his jaw tightening with each of Hank's comments. The basketball star was used to seeing bullies. He'd dealt with plenty in his career, but something about this felt personal. Maybe it was the way Jenny reminded him of his own sister, who'd worked double shifts to put herself through school. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. At his full height, Big Shaq towered over everyone in the diner. Several customers noticed him rise and nudged their companions. Even Mr. Wilson stopped eating his meatloaf to watch what would happen next. Hank was too busy enjoying his moment of power to notice the mountain of a man approaching from behind, but his friends saw. Their laughter died in their throats as Big Shaq's shadow fell across their table. The diner fell so quiet you could hear the sizzle of meat on the grill in the kitchen. Big Shaq moved with surprising grace for a man his size, weaving between tables without bumping a single chair. His plain gray t-shirt stretched across shoulders that had once carried the hopes of basketball fans nationwide. Though he'd been retired for 5 years, he still kept in shape, and it showed. At the counter, Tammy froze mid-pour, coffee pot suspended over a customer's cup. Lou peeked through the order window, spatula in hand. Even Jenny, still kneeling to clean up the spilled beer, looked up when she noticed the change in the room. Hank was laughing at his own joke when he realized his buddies had gone silent. The bald one with the gold chain nudged him and jerked his chin upward, way upward. Something funny. Big Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but somehow filling the entire diner. Hank turned in his seat, the smirk dying on his face as he had to crane his neck to see the giant standing behind him. For a second, raw surprise flashed in his eyes before he covered it with a scowl. "Private conversation, big man," Hank said, trying to sound tough. "Why don't you go back to your pie?" Jenny scrambled to her feet, wet napkins clutched in her hand. "It's okay," she said quickly. "I've got this." Big Shaq gave her a gentle smile that transformed his serious face. "I can see that, ma'am. You're handling it with more grace than most would." He turned back to Hank. "But I think maybe these gentlemen are done making their point." Hank's friend with the snake tattoo snickered. "Who do you think you are, man? The restaurant police?" Big Shaq pulled out an empty chair from the next table and sat down, the wooden seat creaking under his weight. Now at eye level with the bikers, his presence seemed even more imposing. He took off his baseball cap, and several gasps rippled through the diner as people recognized him. "Name's Shaquille Johnson," he said casually. "Friends call me Big Shaq. Used to play some basketball." The biker with the gold chain's eyes widened. "Wait, you're that asterisk Shaquille? Four-time champion Shaquille?" Big Shaq shrugged modestly. "That's me. Now, I run youth centers. Just opened one in town last month, actually." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We teach kids respect there. Seems like some adults could use those lessons too." Hank shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between maintaining his tough guy image and not picking a fight with a famous athlete twice his size. "Look, we're just having some fun. The girl knows we're joking." "Does she?" Big Shaq turned to Jenny, who stood awkwardly nearby, still holding the soggy napkins. "Ma'am, do you find this fun?" Jenny's eyes darted between Big Shaq and Hank. The whole diner was watching. I should get back to work," she mumbled. "City, she's fine," Hank said dismissively. "Mind your business, basketball man." Big Shaq's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Here's the thing about respect. It's not just for people you think deserve it. It's for everyone trying to make an honest living." He nodded toward Jenny. "This lady is working double shifts to put herself through nursing school. That takes guts and determination. What are you doing with your life that gives you the right to make hers harder?" The words hung in the air. A few customers nodded in agreement. Hank's face reddened. "You don't know me," he growled, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You're right, I don't," Big Shaq agreed. "But I know bullies. Coached enough kids to spot one a mile away. Usually, they're just people who are hurting inside, trying to feel big by making others feel small." The bald biker shifted in his seat. The one with the snake tattoo suddenly became very interested in his beer mug. "I ain't no kid," Hank muttered. "No, you're not," Big Shaq said. "Which makes it worse, don't you think?" Mr. Wilson, watching from his booth, broke into a smile and nudged his wife. Tammy resumed pouring coffee, but kept one eye on the confrontation. Leo had come out of the kitchen and stood with arms crossed, ready to back up the basketball star if needed. Jenny had never seen anyone stand up to Hank before. People were usually too intimidated by his size and attitude. But next to Big Shaq, Hank didn't look so intimidating anymore. Big Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, setting it on the table beside Hank's spilled beer. "This should cover the drinks and any cleaning for the lady's uniform. Now, gentlemen, we have two choices for how the rest of this afternoon goes." Hank's right hand curled into a fist under the table. "And what might those be?" Big Shaq leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. His hands rested on his knees, relaxed and open. Nothing about his posture suggested he was ready for a fight, yet everyone in the diner could feel the power radiating from him. "First choice," he said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "You and your friends finish your drinks quietly, leave a nice tip, and we all go about our day." Hank's eyes narrowed. "And the second choice?" "The second choice is a lot less pleasant," Big Shaq said, still calm. "For you, mostly." The threat wasn't stated outright, but it hung in the air between them. Hank glanced at his friends, looking for backup, but found uncertain faces. The bald one with the gold chain was staring at Big Shaq with something close to awe. "You threatening me?" Hank demanded, but his voice cracked slightly. "No, sir, just stating facts," Big Shaq replied. "See, I moved to this town to make a difference. Got tired of seeing guys with nothing better to do than push people around. He looked directly at Jenny, who was still hovering nearby, especially people working hard to better themselves. Jenny felt her cheeks flush. No one had ever stood up for her like this before. Hank pushed his chair back and stood up, trying to reclaim some authority. At his full height, he was still a foot shorter than Big Shaq, even with the basketball star sitting down. "You don't know who you're messing with," Hank growled. "I run with the Skull Riders. We own this town." A few customers exchanged glances. The Skull Riders had a bad reputation, but they weren't nearly as powerful as Hank liked to pretend. Big Shaq stood up slowly, unfolding to his full height. The top of Hank's head barely reached Big Shaq's shoulders. Several people in the diner gasped. It was one thing to know the former basketball player was tall, but seeing him tower over Hank, who was a big man himself, was something else entirely. "Don't much care who you run with," Big Shaq said. "In this diner, right now, it's just you and me having a conversation about respect." Lou had edged closer from the kitchen, holding a spatula like a weapon. Tammy stood near the phone, ready to call the police if things got out of hand. Hank's buddies were looking increasingly uncomfortable. The skinny one with the snake tattoo whispered something to the bald guy, who nodded slightly. "Listen," the bald biker said, surprisingly reasonable, "maybe we should just finish up and head out, Hank. Got that thing at Pete's garage anyway." But Hank was too far in to back down gracefully. "You think because you're some washed-up basketball player, you can come in here and tell me what to do?" Big Shaq smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Washed up, maybe, but still in good enough shape to handle myself." He glanced at Jenny again. "Though fighting isn't really my style these days. Had enough of that growing up." An older couple in a nearby booth stood up, paid their bill quickly, and hurried out. The tension in the air was becoming unbearable. "So what exactly do you want?" Hank asked, trying to sound tough but coming across uncertain. "Two things," Big Shaq said, holding up one massive finger. "First, an apology to the lady for making her job harder than it needs to be." He raised a second finger. "And second, I want you to come see my youth center." This unexpected request caught everyone off guard, especially Hank. "Your what?" "My youth center," Big Shaq repeated. "Got a bunch of kids there who could use some mechanical skills. Heard you run a garage with your club." The bald biker looked surprised. "How'd you know that?" "Small town," Big Shaq shrugged. "People talk. Some of these kids I work with, they need to see there are paths forward that don't involve college. Trades are valuable. Someone who knows bikes could make a real impression." For the first time, Hank looked genuinely confused rather than angry. This wasn't how confrontations usually went for him. "You're asking me to teach kids about motorcycles?" "Might do you some good," Big Shaq said. "Might do them some good too." Jenny watched in amazement. This giant of a man wasn't just defending her. He was offering Hank a chance to be something better than a bully. Mr. Wilson, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from his booth, chuckled softly. "Now that's a checkmate if I ever saw one," he whispered to his wife. Hank stood frozen, clearly trying to figure out how to respond without losing face in front of his gang. His eyes darted from Big Shaq to Jenny to his increasingly restless friends. "And if I say no to both?" he finally asked, his voice carrying less conviction than before. Big Shaq's expression hardened just slightly. "Then choice two it is." The air in Millie's diner felt heavy with tension. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, doing little to cool the heat building between the two men. Every customer sat frozen, forks halfway to mouths, coffee cups suspended in midair. "What exactly is choice two?" Hank asked, his voice lower now, uncertain. Big Shaq rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I know Sheriff Thompson pretty well. Had dinner with him last week, actually. Told me some interesting things about your club's backroom operations." The color drained from Hank's face. The bald biker with the gold chain sat up straight, suddenly alert. "You're bluffing," Hank said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Maybe," Big Shaq smiled. "But are you willing to bet your freedom on that? Sheriff's been looking for a reason to pay your clubhouse a visit." Jenny watched the exchange with wide eyes, clutching her order pad tightly. Even Leo had stopped cooking, his spatula hovering over the grill as he strained to hear every word. Hank glanced at his friends, looking for support, but found none. The skinny one with the snake tattoo had slumped down in his seat, suddenly very interested in picking at a loose thread on his jacket. "This isn't over," Hank muttered, reaching for his wallet. "Actually," Big Shaq said, "it can be. Right here, right now." He nodded toward Jenny. "One genuine apology one afternoon at my youth center. That's all I'm asking." Hank looked at Jenny, then back at Big Shaq. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. "Fine," he finally spat out. "Sorry for the trouble, miss." Big Shaq shook his head. "Not like that. A real apology. Look her in the eyes and say it like you mean it." Hank's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. Then, surprisingly, his shoulders sagged slightly. "I'm sorry," he said to Jenny, his voice a bit softer, "for knocking over the beer. And other stuff won't happen again." The apology wasn't exactly heartfelt, but it was more than anyone had ever expected from Hank Turner. Jenny nodded, too shocked to speak. "Could start," Big Shaq said. "Now about the youth center." "I said I'd do it, didn't I?" Hank interrupted. "One afternoon, that's it." Big Shaq extended his massive hand. "Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Just you." Hank hesitated before reluctantly shaking the offered hand, his own disappearing in Big Shaq's grip. "Now," Big Shaq continued, "how about you folks enjoy your meal in peace?" It wasn't really a suggestion. Hank dropped some bills on the table, more than enough to cover their tab and a decent tip, and jerked his head toward the door. His gang scrambled to follow, keeping a respectful distance from Big Shaq as they filed out. The bell above the door jingled as they left, the sound breaking the spell that had fallen over the diner. As soon as the door closed behind them, the restaurant erupted in chatter. Several customers stood up to clap Big Shaq on the back. Mr. Wilson gave him a thumbs up from his booth. "I've been coming here 20 years, an old-timer at the counter said, never seen anyone stand up to that bunch like that." Lou emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "Meals on the house today, Mr. Johnson. Whatever you want." Big Shaq smiled but shook his head. "Appreciate it, but I pay my way. Just a coffee refill would be nice, though." Jenny approached cautiously, coffee pot in hand. "Thank you," she said quietly as she refilled his cup. "No one's ever. I mean, they've been making my life miserable for months." "Sometimes people just need a reminder about respect," Big Shaq replied, adding a packet of sugar to his coffee. "Especially men like that who think being tough means putting others down." "Do you really think he'll show up tomorrow?" Jenny asked, glancing toward the door where the bikers had exited. "Hard to say," Big Shaq admitted. "But I meant what I said about the sheriff." Jenny's eyes widened. "So that wasn't a bluff?" Big Shaq laughed, a deep, rich sound that filled the diner. "Some things are better left mysterious, Miss Jenny." As she turned to check on her other tables, Jenny couldn't help but smile. For the first time in months, she felt like someone was on her side. Tammy sidled up beside her. "So," she whispered, "that's what a real man looks like." Jenny watched as Big Shaq returned to his apple pie, somehow seeming both imposing and gentle at the same time. "Yeah," she agreed. "I guess it is." Outside in the parking lot, Hank sat on his motorcycle, keys in hand but engine off. His gang waited nervously, unsure why they hadn't left yet. "Boss," the bald one ventured, "we going or what?" Hank stared at the diner, a strange mix of emotions crossing his face. "Yeah," he finally said, starting his bike with a roar. "We're going." But as they pulled away, Hank couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow might change things in ways he couldn't predict. 6 months later, Millie's diner was busier than it had ever been. The old place had gotten a fresh coat of paint, new menus, and even a small patio out back with 4 tables. Word had spread about what happened that day between Big Shaq and Hank, and people came as much for the story as they did for Lou's famous apple pie. Jenny pushed through the kitchen doors, balancing 3 plates of steaming food. Her uniform was different now, a light blue instead of the old faded pink, and a small pin on her collar read Shift Manager. Her steps were lighter these days, her smile more genuine. "Order up for the Wilson table," she called cheerfully, setting down plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Mrs. Wilson beamed at her. "How's school going, dear? You must be finishing your first semester soon." "Final exams next week," Jenny replied, straightening the salt and pepper shakers. "It's tough, but I'm hanging in there. We're all so proud of you, Mr. Wilson said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. This whole town is. Jenny felt her cheeks warm. She'd heard those words more in the past 6 months than in her entire life before. Ever since that day when Big Shaq had stood up for her, things had changed, not just for her, but for the whole community. The bell above the door jingled, and Jenny looked up to see a familiar figure duck under the doorframe. Big Shaq had become a regular, coming in most mornings for coffee and toast before heading to his youth center. Today, though, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Hank. The biker looked different. His beard was trimmed neatly, his leather jacket clean and free of patches. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The angry scowl that had seemed permanently etched on his face was gone, replaced by something calmer, more at peace. "Afternoon, Jenny," Big Shaq called out, taking his usual seat at the counter. Hank nodded a greeting, almost shy. Jenny grabbed 2 menus and approached them. "The usual, Big Shaq." "And for you, Hank?" "Just coffee," Hank said. "Got a class starting at 4. That single afternoon at the youth center had somehow turned into a regular gig. What started as Hank reluctantly showing a few teens how to change motorcycle oil had evolved into a twice-weekly workshop. Kids who'd never had a male role model suddenly had someone who knew their names, expected them to show up, and taught them skills that could lead to real jobs. "Big group today?" Jenny asked, pouring their coffee. 15 kids, Hank confirmed, a hint of pride in his voice. "Got 2 of them interviews at Pete's garage next week." "Speaking of which," Big Shaq added, stirring sugar into his coffee, "that scholarship program you suggested is really taking off. Got funding for 10 kids next fall." Jenny smiled. The scholarship had been Hank's idea, surprisingly enough. After learning about Jenny's struggle to pay for nursing school, he'd approached Big Shaq about setting up something for teenagers who wanted to learn trades, mechanics, plumbing, electrical work, but couldn't afford the training. "That's fantastic," she said sincerely. Behind them, the door jingled again. The other 4 members of Hank's former gang walked in, now regular customers who behaved respectfully and tipped well. The bald one with the gold chain, whose name Jenny had learned was Ray, waved at her. "Hey, Jenny. Got those flyers ready for the fundraiser?" "In the back," she replied. "I'll grab them for you." The motorcycle club had transformed over the past months, focusing more on community service than causing trouble. They still looked tough in their leather jackets, but now they organized charity rides and helped elderly residents with home repairs. As Jenny headed to the back office, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror by the kitchen. The tired, anxious girl from 6 months ago was gone. In her place stood a woman with purpose, halfway to becoming a nurse, respected by her community. From his seat at the counter, Big Shaq watched her go, a satisfied smile on his face. Sometimes all it took was one person standing up, one moment of courage, to change not just a life, but an entire community. The ripple effects of that day had spread further than anyone could have imagined. "You know," Hank said quietly, turning his coffee cup in his hands, "I never properly thanked you." Big Shaq raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself," Hank replied. "For giving me a chance instead of a beating. Lord knows I deserved the latter." Big Shaq placed his massive hand on Hank's shoulder. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe they can be better. The rest is up to them." Outside, the afternoon sun painted Main Street golden. Through the diner window, you could see the youth center 2 blocks down, its fresh mural visible from here. A colorful painting of hands of all sizes reaching upward toward the sky. Beside it, in careful letters, was written, "It's never too late to become who you might have been." 6 months later, Millie's Diner was hosting a special celebration. Colorful balloons tied to the backs of chairs bounced gently in the air conditioning. A hand-painted banner hung across the back wall reading, "Congratulations, Jenny," in bright blue letters. Nearly every booth and table was filled with townspeople chatting excitedly. Lou had outdone himself with a 3-tier cake decorated with a nurse's cap made of frosting. It sat proudly on the counter next to a stack of paper plates and plastic forks. Tammy was busy arranging a pile of small wrapped gifts on a corner table. The bell above the door jingled as Jenny walked in, still wearing her blue uniform from her morning shift. She stopped short, her eyes widening as everyone turned toward her. Surprise! The crowd shouted in unison. Jenny's hands flew to her mouth. "What is all this?" Tammy rushed over and gave her a hug. "It's for you, honey, for finishing your first semester of nursing school with straight A's. And for putting up with us for 3 years," Lou called from behind the counter, waving a spatula in the air. Tears welled in Jenny's eyes as she looked around the packed diner. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were there, along with most of her regular customers. Even Sheriff Thompson had shown up, out of uniform but still wearing his signature cowboy boots. "I don't know what to say," Jenny stammered. "This is too much." "Nothing's too much for our favorite waitress," a deep voice rumbled from the back of the room. The crowd parted to reveal Big Shaq, towering over everyone else. He was dressed in a button-up shirt rather than his usual t-shirt, and he was holding a small envelope. "You've worked harder than anyone I know," he said, walking forward. "Double shifts here, late nights studying, early morning classes. You've earned this." He handed her the envelope. Jenny opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a certificate. As she read it, her eyes grew even wider. This is a full scholarship for next year," she whispered. "How did you?" Big Shaq grinned. "Not just me. The whole town pitched in." He gestured around the diner. "Everyone here contributed something." Mrs. Wilson nodded enthusiastically. "We're all investing in your future, dear." Jenny wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know how to thank you all." "Actually," Big Shaq said, "there's someone else you should thank." He turned toward the door just as it opened again. Hank stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in a clean button-up shirt, his beard neatly trimmed. He was holding a small wrapped package. The room fell silent as he walked toward Jenny. 6 months ago, such a scene would have been unimaginable. But Hank had surprised everyone, including himself. That one afternoon at the youth center had turned into regular volunteer work. The kids responded to his no-nonsense approach and practical skills. For many of them, he was the first adult man who had ever shown consistent interest in their lives. "Heard about your grades," Hank said gruffly, holding out the package. "Got you something." Jenny unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful stethoscope in a leather case. Her name was engraved on a small silver plate attached to the case. "Thought you might need it," Hank mumbled. "For next semester." "Thank you," Jenny said sincerely. "This means a lot." Hank nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The kids at the center helped pick it out. "They're proud of you too." Big Shaq clapped a massive hand on Hank's shoulder. "Tell her the other news." A hint of a smile crossed Hank's face. "My garage is official now. Got the business license last week. Taking on 2 apprentices from the youth center." The townspeople applauded. Even Sheriff Thompson gave an approving nod. The transformation in Hank over the past months had been remarkable. From town bully to business owner and mentor, he had found purpose in helping the same community he once terrorized. "All right, enough standing around." Lou shouted from behind the counter. "Let's eat some cake." As the celebration continued, Jenny found herself sitting in a booth with Big Shaq, watching the unlikely mix of people mingling together. The sheriff chatting with Hank's biker friends, Tammy teaching some teenagers how to properly fold napkins, Mr. Wilson telling a story that had everyone around him laughing. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Jenny said. "All because you decided to stand up that day." Big Shaq shook his head. "I just provided a push. The real change happened because Hank decided to be better, and you never gave up on your dreams." "Still," Jenny insisted, "what made you do it? You didn't even know me." Big Shaq looked thoughtful as he sipped his coffee. "My grandma used to say that change doesn't happen when good people do nothing. That day, I just couldn't do nothing anymore." Across the room, Hank was showing a teenager how to cut the cake without crushing the frosting. His face had lost its permanent scowl, replaced by the patient expression of a teacher. "Sometimes people just need a second chance," Big Shaq continued. "And sometimes they need someone to remind them that they matter." Jenny smiled and looked around at the community that had come together to support her. "Well, I'm grateful. For all of it." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Millie's diner, it illuminated a scene very different from the one 6 months ago, not just a group of people sharing food, but a community that had learned what it meant to stand up for each other, to believe in second chances, and to help dreams come true.